Imagine waking up one day and realizing you've been disappearing slowly, piece by piece, while smiling in the mirror the entire time. At first, it's almost imperceptible. You brush your teeth, drink your coffee, check your phone. Everything seems normal, but there's a subtle shift. Thoughts feel outsourced. Your desires no longer feel like your own. Something else is piloting your decisions, whispering justifications in your own voice. And you believe it because it sounds like you. It feels like you. But it isn't. This isn't science fiction. It's addiction. But not just addiction to substances. The more insidious kind is psychological. The addiction to control, to approval, to routine, to comfort, to screens, to numbness, to being liked, to not feeling anything at all. And the terrifying part, you don't notice the hijacking while it's happening. That's how the best captors work. They don't break down the door, they convince you to hand them the key. Willingly, silently. Here's the paradox. You still think you're free. You believe you're making choices. You assume you're in control. But what if the very mechanism you rely on to feel like yourself has been rewired? What if addiction isn't something you do but something that becomes you? There's an ancient Greek word, akrasia, meaning the state of acting against your better judgment, knowing what is right, and still doing the opposite. Socrates called it the great human contradiction. But what if akrasia isn't a failure of willpower, but a symptom of self-fracture? A war between the you who wants and the you who knows. Picture this. You tell yourself, just one more episode, just one more scroll, just one more drink. And yet, each one more is a ritual and offering to an invisible force that now rules your cravings, your focus, your time, your identity, and the question becomes unbearable. Where does habit end and selfhood begin? Imagine your sense of self as a delicate thread woven from thousands of daily decisions. Addiction, whether to substances, validation, distraction, or self-punishment, is the slow unraveling of that thread, not in one dramatic tug, but with the patient precision of erosion. And by the time you notice, you're left with strands of a person you don't recognize, repeating routines you don't remember choosing, in pursuit of comforts that no longer comfort. You try to quit. You try to change. You really believe this. Time is different. But as the hours pass, you slip because something in you isn't aligned. Something deeper, something older, something hungry. You may think, I still have goals. I still have dreams. I still want to get better. But who is the I that wants these things? And who is the I that sabotages them? Carl Jung once wrote, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Perhaps addiction is not merely a craving, but a possession. A parasitic idea, disguised as your own voice, hiding in the shadows of your unresolved pain. So now we must ask, is your personality truly yours? Or has it been shaped by your patterns of escape? Have your dreams been chosen? Or have they been fed to you, reward by dopamine reward? And most chilling of all, what if the version of you that emerges from addiction is not you at all but a mask that learned how to smile through the void? Maybe that's why change feels like death, because it is. The death of the false self. The one addiction built, the one you fed, protected, and wore like armor. But armor eventually becomes a prison. We often speak of addiction as if it's about substances or behaviors. But what if that's the shallowest layer? What if the deeper truth is this? Addiction is the story you tell yourself to justify your continued disappearance. It's time to look deeper, beneath the cravings, beneath the triggers, beneath the rituals. Because the real question isn't how do I stop? It's what part of me believes I deserve this. Addiction doesn't begin in the hand reaching for the bottle, or the eyes locked on the screen. It begins far earlier, beneath memory, beneath logic. In the unspoken spaces, where identity is formed. You were not born fragmented. You came into this world, whole screaming, instinctual, alive. But then the world began its quiet work. It praised certain parts of you and ignored others. It taught you which feelings were acceptable, which thoughts were dangerous, which dreams were realistic. Over time, your authentic self, curious, chaotic, hungry for connection, was split apart, sectioned off into categories of good and bad. You learned how to perform, how to please, how to survive, and somewhere in that splitting, addiction found its opening. Carl Jung called this internal division the creation of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we're taught to reject: anger, grief, neediness, vulnerability. These aspects don't disappear. They go underground, into the unconscious, but they don't stay quiet. They become forces we don't understand, but obey. They guide our compulsions. They whisper, "You're not enough." And we obey them not out of choice, but out of fear. Addiction is not random, it is architectural. It thrives where the self has been wounded, where the emotional scaffolding has collapsed, where unprocessed pain lingers like rot beneath polished surfaces. Dr. Gabor Maté, a physician who spent decades working with addicts on Vancouver's East Side, wrote, "The question is not, why the addiction, but why the pain? The addict is not seeking a high, they are seeking relief. Relief from what? From the unbearable experience of being themselves? From shame, from absence, from the chronic ache of being unseen, unloved, misunderstood. Addiction is not about the substance. It's about the void the substance tries to fill. A void shaped by trauma, abandonment, disconnection. A void that becomes so familiar, we confuse it with our personality." Philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer described the human condition as oscillating between boredom and pain. He saw life not as a pursuit of happiness, but a relentless fleeing from suffering. And in a culture that worships productivity and pleasure, where silence is awkward, stillness is lazy, and rest is indulgent, addiction becomes the default response to a world that refuses to hold our suffering with tenderness. We are trained to cope, not to heal, to manage symptoms, not to excavate roots. We treat addiction like a personal failure, when in truth, it's a cultural symptom, a sign that our collective story about what it means to be human is broken. Nietzsche once wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But here lies the modern tragedy. We are drowning in how, but starved of why. We know how to function, how to grind, how to distract ourselves, but we've lost touch with meaning, connection, presence. We've been conditioned to numb instead of feel, to consume instead of reflect, to conform instead of question. This is the perfect ecosystem for addiction to flourish, because addiction is not a glitch in the system. It is the system. Every like, every notification, every dopamine spike from food, sex, scrolling, applause, each one is a momentary escape from a deeper hunger. Not a hunger for pleasure, but for presence, for truth, for homecoming. But instead of facing that hunger, we become experts at not feeling. We construct elaborate defense mechanisms. I'm just stressed. Everyone does it. It's harmless. I can stop any time. These aren't excuses, they're survival scripts. And they're written by the parts of us still trying to protect the child we once were. The child who first learned it wasn't safe to feel. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that man is condemned to be free, thrown into existence with no instruction manual, forced to define meaning in a meaningless universe. And in that absurd freedom, addiction offers seductive structure, a rhythm, a god, something to orbit around, something that feels like purpose, even if it destroys us. But here's the secret most people don't dare admit. Addiction works. It gives relief. It gives control. It gives identity. Until it takes everything else. The self, in its essence, is not a fixed object. It is a process, a living conversation between your past, present, and imagined future. Addiction interrupts that conversation. It freezes you in a loop. It says, "This is who you are now." And you believe it. because belief is easier than uncertainty. But what if the you that addiction creates is only a mask built around pain? You see, addiction doesn't just alter your behavior, rewires your perception of who you are. It creates a false self, obedient, dependent, disconnected, a self that confuses craving with identity, avoidance with safety, and escape with peace. And the longer you wear that self, the more convincing it becomes. So when people say, just quit, they don't understand. They don't see that addiction is fused with your survival mechanisms. That to quit isn't just to stop it's to dismantle the psychological scaffolding holding up your entire identity. Addiction is not the disease, it's the symptom of a deeper disease, the war between your true self and the self you became to survive. And now we stand on the edge of a terrifying question. What happens when the mask becomes more real than the face beneath it? Addiction is not loud. It does not storm the gates. It slips in, unnoticed, dressed as routine, disguised as relief. And by the time it has settled in, it doesn't look like chaos, it looks like you. That is its greatest trick. It doesn't just alter your behavior. It becomes the architect of your identity. And as it quietly rearranges your mental furniture, you begin to mistake the interior of a prison for the shape of a home. But this is not merely a personal loss, it's an existential theft. Because when addiction hijacks the self, it also rewrites your story. It distorts your perception, warps your memories, blurs your future. The real tragedy is not what addiction takes away, it's what it replaces. Your passion is replaced by urgency. Your dreams are replaced by survival. Your values are replaced by impulse. Your relationships are replaced by transactions. Your why is replaced by when. When can I get the next fix? When can I escape this discomfort? When will it feel okay again? But that okay never arrives. Because addiction is not a destination. It is a treadmill of diminishing returns. Each hit, each scroll, each binge feels more necessary, yet delivers less. The pleasure curve flattens, but the dependence deepens, and while the external world may continue her job, your social life, your obligations internally, something sacred is deteriorating. The mind becomes fogged, not just by substances, but by shame. The body stiffens, not from age, but from emotional contraction. Time blurs, not from speed, but from dissociation. You may look in the mirror and still recognize your face, but your eyes, those ancient windows of the soul, start to go dim, because the one inside is tired, not from effort, but from forgetting who they are. And then come the secondary consequences, the ones that linger long after the high fades. 1. Your emotional landscape narrows. Addiction flattens your inner world. It turns nuanced feelings into binary ones, pleasure or pain, relief or discomfort. You lose the capacity to sit with ambiguity, to wrestle with conflicting emotions, to feel deeply without escaping. Over time, your emotional vocabulary shrinks. Joy feels muted, grief feels unbearable, and boredom becomes the most terrifying emotion of all, because it reveals the emptiness that addiction was built to hide. 2. Your relationships become conditional. When addiction pilots the self, relationships suffer, not always dramatically, but subtly. Intimacy is replaced with performance. Vulnerability is replaced with evasion. Trust is replaced with transaction. And slowly, those who love you begin to realize they are loving a version of you that is no longer home. Worse still, you begin to manipulate others not out of malice, but out of necessity. You need them to play certain roles. The enabler, the forgiver, the mirror. Because without them, your false self would crack. And so even your love becomes infected by strategy. 3. Your world shrinks. The addicted self cannot tolerate unpredictability. It seeks control, comfort, and repetition. So you stop exploring. You stop risking. You stop growing. Your life becomes a loop. Work, numb, repeat. Curiosity fades. Wonder dies. You live less like a soul in search of truth, and more like a machine in need of maintenance. And because addiction rewards isolation, you begin to withdraw from friends, from family, from silence, from your own reflection. 4. Your meaning-making mechanism breaks. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We endure suffering when it feels purposeful. We survive pain when it feels redemptive. But addiction severs that process. It makes your suffering feel pointlessly, recurring cycle with no redemptive arc. And once meaning is gone, nihilism creeps in. You stop asking, "Who am I becoming?" and start asking, "What's the point?" At this stage, you don't even realize how deeply addiction has grafted itself onto your sense of self. You think you're tired, unmotivated, broken. You think this is just your personality now, but it isn't. It's the residue of repetition. It's the spiritual callus formed by years of self-abandonment. Even your inner critic becomes addicted to judgment, to shame, to the illusion of control. It says, "You'll never change. You always mess it up. This is just who you are." And that voice becomes familiar, strangely comforting, because even though it hurts, it's predictable. And in the landscape of addiction, predictability is mistaken for safety. But here's the most unsettling consequence of all. You forget what freedom even feels like. Not just freedom from the substance or behavior, but freedom from compulsion, from fear, from the relentless pressure to soothe an ache you don't fully understand. You forget how it feels to wake up unpossessed, to desire something from your soul, not from your trauma. You forget how it feels to look someone in the eyes without hiding, to be present, to be still, to be you. And this amnesia is dangerous, because if you forget who you were before the addiction took over, you may stop believing you ever existed. Society does little to help. In fact, it often rewards your dissociation. It calls your overworking hustle. It calls your need for control, discipline. It calls your numbing self-care. And in a world addicted to addiction itself, those who begin to wake up often feel like the crazy ones. But maybe that disorientation is the first sign of healing. Maybe the discomfort you feel now, the longing, the emptiness, the quiet ache is not a sign of failure, but the first real evidence that the real you is trying to come back. Because if addiction hijacks the self by narrowing it, isolating it, and numbing it, then healing must begin by expanding it, by remembering it, by reclaiming the parts of you that never needed to escape in the first place. Freedom does not begin with triumph, it begins with defiance. Not the loud kind, not the kind that smashes bottles or burns bridges or deletes every app in a midnight purge. No, real rebellion begins in silence, in a whisper, in a tiny, trembling voice inside you that finally says, "This isn't me." And it's not dramatic. It doesn't feel heroic. It often feels like grief, because the first step toward reclaiming the self isn't victory, it's mourning. You mourn the time you've lost, the opportunities you let die, the people you pushed away. You mourn the parts of yourself you buried to survive, the laughter that became rare, the truth you stopped telling, the body that became a battleground. But this grief is sacred. It means something is waking up, something that remembers dimly, achingly, that you were never meant to live like this. You were not born to chase numbness. You were born to feel, to burn, to break open. And here's the most counterintuitive truth of all. Breaking free from addiction is not about controlling yourself. It's about learning to trust yourself again. This is why most approaches to recovery fail, because they treat you like a machine that's malfunctioning. They give you rigid rules, punishment systems, behavioral hacks. But you're not a machine. You are a soul wrapped in pain, a being shaped by love and loss and longing. You don't need more control. You need a deeper connection. Nietzsche once said, "Become who you are, not become someone new. Not fix what is broken, but return. Return to the version of you that addiction tried to erase. So how do you do that? 1. You make space for the truth. This is terrifying, because the truth is raw, messy, inconvenient. You start by sitting in silence not for answers, but to hear what addiction has been drowning out, the grief, the rage, the yearning, and most of all the voice that's been trying to get your attention all along. You don't fight the cravings. You witness them. You observe how they rise in the body, how they seduce the mind, how they make promises they never keep. And in that observation, something magical happens. You create distance. You begin to see that cravings are not you. They are visitors. And visitors don't own the house. 2. You befriend the shadow. Carl Jung taught that transformation only occurs when we face the parts of ourselves we've exiled. That means meeting your shame, your weakness, your unmet needs. Not to judge them, but to understand them. Because every addictive behavior, at its root, is a strategy, a desperate solution to a deeper problem. When you stop treating your cravings as enemies, and start listening to what they're trying to protect you, uncover the original wound, and once you find the wound, you can finally begin to heal it with compassion instead of coping mechanisms. 3. You build rituals that nourish instead of numb. Addiction thrives on habit. So must your freedom. You need to replace rituals of escape with rituals of remembrance. Move your body not to punish it, but to reconnect with it. Write not to perform, but to remember who you are beneath the noise. Sit with people who speak. Truth not comfort. Create anything that doesn't aim to impress, but to express. These aren't productivity hacks. They're lifelines. Because every small act of presence weakens the grip of the false self. 4. You speak the unspoken. Shame grows in silence. Addiction depends on secrecy. But when you say, "This is what I'm struggling with" out loud, to someone who won't flinch, you break the curse. Connection is the antidote to compulsion. You don't need 10 people who understand you. You just need one, and often, that connection becomes the crack where the light enters. 5. You stop seeking perfection and start embracing repair. Relapse is not failure, it's information. It's feedback from your unconscious. It shows you where you're still vulnerable, where you still need tenderness. You're not here to become some purified version of yourself. You're here to become whole. And wholeness includes mess, setbacks, scars. As the Japanese art of kintsugi teaches, broken pottery repaired with gold becomes more beautiful, not less. The cracks are no longer flaws. They are testaments. 6. You cultivate meaning, not motivation. Motivation fades. Willpower exhausts. But meaning endures. So ask yourself not, how do I stay sober? But what is worth staying awake for? What is the life that addiction tried to steal from you? What would it feel like to wake up, day after day, and move toward something that makes your soul feel alive? As Viktor Frankl taught in the darkest corners of a Nazi concentration camp, those who have a why to live can bear almost any how. Find your why. Not in lofty goals or external approval, but in your own sacred aliveness. This is rebellion, not against society, not against others, but against the false self that addiction built. The one that whispered you were weak, that you were broken, that you needed the fix, that you'd never be enough. That self must die for the true self to emerge. And when it does, you'll recognize something strange. You were never addicted to the substance. You were addicted to the absence of yourself, to the void, to the silence, to the numbness that filled the space where your soul once danced. But now, that soul is stirring, and your job is not to fix it. Your job is to welcome it home. What if addiction was never the enemy, but the messenger? What if, all this time, the craving wasn't trying to destroy you but trying to awaken you? There comes a moment, quiet, disorienting, holy, when the war ends. Not because you won, but because you finally listened. And in that stillness, a deeper truth begins to rise, one that shatters everything you thought you knew. You were never broken. You were never sick. You were never weak. You were trying to survive in a world that taught you to forget your soul. Addiction was never about pleasure. It was about pain. But more than that, it was about separation from your body, from your truth, from your breath, from the ancient knowing that once whispered to you before the world got too loud. And now, after all the loops, all the shame, all the desperate grasping, you arrive at a cliff. And for the first time, you see the full landscape, not just of your choices, but of your being. You see the younger version of you, the one who first picked up the bottle, or the phone, or the lie because they didn't know what else to do. And instead of blaming them, you kneel, you reach out, you whisper, you did the best you could. You were trying to feel safe, and I'm so sorry you had to go it alone. This is not sentimentality, this is liberation. Because to forgive yourself is to reclaim yourself. And only the true self, the one beneath the wounds, can walk the road forward. You realize something profound. Addiction didn't hijack you. It revealed you. It showed you where the fracture was, where love was missing, where fear had rooted itself so deeply you mistook it for your nature. It was your mirror, and in that mirror, you don't just see your pain, you see your power. Not the performative kind, not the curated confidence that crumbles under pressure, but the kind that comes from standing naked in front of your own darkness and saying, I'm still here. I remember who I am now. This remembrance is everything, because the final truth, the one you weren't ready to hear before, is this: you are not your addiction. You are the awareness that survived it. You are the one who watched yourself disappear and chose to come back. And that choice, that sacred return, that is what makes you whole again. Not your abstinence, not your success, not your perfect routine or spiritual enlightenment. Just this, the willingness to be with yourself fully, brutally, tenderly, without needing to escape. You begin to see that the self you were trying to construct all these years, the image, the performance, the hustle for worth, was always a mask. And when that mask cracks, when the illusion dissolves, when all that remains is you shivering, aching, radiant, that is when the real journey begins. You no longer need to fill the void, because the void was never empty. It was space waiting to be remembered. Room for your spirit to expand. Room for meaning, for connection, for truth. And slowly, you begin to live differently. You don't chase pleasure, you create it. You don't numb pain, you honor it. You don't seek validation, you offer presence. You don't run from discomfort, you hold it like a teacher. You are not healed. You are healing, and that is more than enough. Because healing isn't a destination, it's a relationship with yourself, with reality, with the parts of you that addiction once tried to erase. And you carry this truth now, etched into your bones. Freedom isn't about doing whatever you want. It's about no longer being enslaved to what you no longer need. It's about waking up each day, looking in the mirror, and seeing someone who isn't running, who isn't hiding, who isn't pretending. Someone who says, I know what it means to lose myself, and I know how to come back. That's the ultimate truth. Not that addiction hijacked you, but that you reclaimed yourself. And now, the world waits for your return. Not as a perfect being, not as a clean slate survivor, but as something far more real. A human being who has met their own abyss and chosen, again and again, to walk back into the light. Not because it was easy, but because it was true.